We can even push the paradox further by looking at how the reading for this week describes myth as the reality itself. That's the only way in which we can make sense of myth as a living, moving kind of document. The same way that language is changing along the years with the way that we are changing, the myth is adapting to the lives that we are living in the world that we are living in. Malinowski said myth as it exists in the savage community, that is, in its living primitive form, is not merely a story told, but a reality lived. It is not the nature of fiction, such as we read today in a novel, but it is a living reality, believed to have once happened in primeval time and continuing ever since to influence the world and human destinies. The myth is to the savage what to a fully believing Christian is the biblical story of creation, the fall, the redemption of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. As our sacred story lives in our ritual and our morality, it is governed our faith and controls our conduct. Even so does his myth for the savage. So once again, probably need to set aside the racist undertones and the separation between different eras, really, because as we mentioned before, the Bible is Christian myth. There is no difference there. There is no reason to make a difference. And it is, as a result, a little bit more interesting to think of how the lived myth is a reality that is embodied in people's experiences in the way in which they will react to new elements, to difficult elements, to the challenges that are happening every day. So putting the possibility of the myth in the terms of something that is uniquely created by humans and sometimes uniquely assimilated by humans, we can even go further as to put up to the fact that a myth is also something that is owned by the people who are listening and even sometimes by the people who are telling them, because this is another form of dialogue that is happening here. Every time the myth is told and retold, the people who are listening are gleaning parts of it, making it more theirs. Every story is owned by a member of the community. Each story, though known by many, may be recited only by the quote-unquote owner, who may, however, present it to someone else by teaching that person and authorizing him to retell it. But not all the owners know how to thrill and to raise the hearty laugh, which is one of the main ends of such stories. A good raconteur has to change his voice in the dialogue, chant the ditties with due temperament, gesticulate, and in general play to the gallery. Some of these tales are certainly quote-unquote smoking room stories. Of others, I will give one or two examples. And you can certainly look at the reading and perusal to see the examples that Malinowski gives, but the process is a matter um, of 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 embodying the myth, of making the myth closer to our reality, shifting that border that we've talked about in the last few days to something that is a dynamic relationship between us and the world, between us and the unknown, and making that a living document of the world that we are living in rather than a dead letter or a fiction that we could just easily put away into a book or another form of story. The result of that is that the most efficient myths are the ones that seem to have a specific style to themselves. And in as much as myths are usually part of an oral tradition, that is, that they are told orally, not written down, some people have tried to look at how the myth has existed historically as part of a performance, much more so than a quote unquote dead letter as a writing. This is a strategy told by Milman Perry, who was an American folklorist, I guess. He was studying folk singers, especially in Yugoslavia, so a form of folklore that is oral by default, by design. And he said, now any complete discussion of epic style must take into consideration the larger subject of epic psychology, society, even religion. For since the proper study of style is the study of the ability with which an artist has expressed his ideas, the first thing is to know the nature of the author's thought. The element of diction, however, the choice of words for the expression of the ideas, which is the one of the constituents of style, is at once a more limited and a more tangible matter, and it is from the study of this that we shall attempt to gain some understanding of the broader field of style. We cannot be unsuccessful. It would be like studying the heart without learning anything about the body. And again, we have this idea of a conversation. We have this idea of a link between the story and the life of the people, even the life of the community as a whole. But Perry was studying Homer and the grand Greek narratives, and looking at how, in the way that these myths were told, they contained elements of style which were repeated, kind of like a refrain in a song, and that certain words were used apparently very deliberately by the people who were telling the myth, which would have made it stickier. And of course, this is what we're talking about here. We are talking about the elements of the myth that stand out, the one that are important to the story, but also the ones that are important to the storyteller, but also the ones that are important to the listener. Once you can combine all of those, you can really make sense of how the myth has been able to stay for all these years. And this is especially relevant in the context of these ancient Greek myths that are hundreds of pages long. I mean, they are 10,000 words of stories that have to be remembered to a certain extent. There is no way in which a person would know these things entirely by heart. They would have to know the beats, the kind of the standout places, and the ways in which the story had to be told for it to be useful and successful. And so, looking at Homer, especially, so Perry identifies certain formula that are part of the story, the way in which the story would not change from one teller to the other, or from one version to the other, and they would retain those very specific structure that the different storytellers might be able to play with, as long as they kept those important parts. And so it kind of goes to these stylistic building blocks, the way that the theme of Levi-Strauss was pointing out. And once you get to those important aspects, once you find those building blocks, you can make sense out of how the process kind of becomes one of building your myth around it. That's something else that Boas had already pointed out in 1916 in the article that I started with in the last video. I believe a clearer insight into the character of the whole cycle may be obtained by determining the popularity of the various incidents according to the number of people made among various tribes and from various narrators. In the table following, given the number of versions that have been recorded from each tribe, naturally, when telling myths to a collector, the natives will tell those first with which they are most familiar and which appeal more strongly to their imagination. In this sense, the table will give us an impression of the popularity and the relative importance of the various incident of the tale. So the way in which those elements are retained is because they stick with the person who is telling them. So if the storyteller can remember them, they are more likely to tell that story. And of course, the best remembered, if you ask what is your favorite story or what is the best story, this is the one that is the most meaningful to you. So if it makes sense to the person as the storyteller, it should make sense to the person as the listener. And this is how, over the years, some elements will become more steadfast than others because they are more easily remembered and they are more easily told and they become more invested, owned by the various people in a process. Perry Millman's student finished his work, and a person named Lord says it may seem strange that we have seen whether we have very few texts from singers in the earliest stage of apprenticeship, as it were, in their art. But collectors seek the best singers, and the best singers are usually the older men. Their reputation is great. They are brought forward by those whom the collector questions. On occasion, a younger singer in his 20s or 30s may be suggested, often because he has a good voice or a fine manner of singing, more rarely because he is a narrator of quality. Yet it should surprise it's yet it should surprise us that it has not occurred to anyone to make a special study of the youngest group. It is a commentary indeed on the form of the belief that the songs are set and that younger singers have not had time to memorize the song as well as an older man. Perhaps exposing this belief as false will encourage giving more attention to songs of the younger singers, imperfect though they may be. So Lord pointed out that this becomes kind of a self-sustaining process here because the older people who have told the story many times are the ones that are recognized um, as a valuable thing. And if they keep repeating it and if they keep being in charge of telling the story will remain with them rather than being transferred to the younger generation. And it is kind of a mistake that Lord pointed out in a lot of folklore studies that people would focus on essentially only the best storytellers, only the ones that are better recognized by the others, because that's only kind of keeping the idea that those are the only valid versions. If the myth can continue in a variety of ways, if anyone can retell the myth, then it should be only fair that we look at the different versions according to which that story is told. And perhaps this is what it provides the most value to the myth itself. It's not the fact that it can be narrowed down to one very specific version. It's the fact that it can exist in many forms. It's that different people may have different ways to resonate with the myth, and those different ways may be seen as otherwise incompatible. Maybe because of an age difference, maybe because of a privilege difference, whatever it is, those different parts of society are all exposed to the myth in various forms. The myth itself remains the same, but the performances are many. And so Lord points out in the month and years of boyhood, not very long indeed after he has learned to speak his own language, the future singer develops a realization that in sung stories, the order of words is often not the same as in everyday speech. Verbs may be placed in unusual positions, auxiliaries may be omitted, cases may be used strangely. He is impressed by the special effect this results, and he associates the syntactic peculiarities with the singing of tales. Moreover, the linking of phrases by parallelism, balancing and opposition of word order become familiar to him. So the person learns very early by the pattern, by the repetition, what the important moments are, and those are the ones that become meaningful. But they learn, they balance, as the Lord pointed out here. Learn the careful manufacturing of the myth as a meaningful story, because the meaning itself exists in between those words, not just in the formula, not just in the on the salient points any more than when you watch a football game, you watch it only for the goals. You're watching it for the larger story that is told, for the fight, for the going back and forth. And the myth is really no different than any other form of entertainment in that case. It is just one that people will put a lot of energy into. And of course, the more energy is put into it, the more that energy is repeated and assimilated. So, putting the myth into its context means also making sense of how those stories will be relevant to the people that tell them. And we go back here to Joseph Campbell, who points out that those differences between the time in which the story is repeated and the time in which we are living is the most important part of this conversation here, is because we learn from the repetition of something that looks different or looks stylistically different from that our current life is stylistically different as well. So the myth shows us how much things have changed, how much it has disappeared, how much it has reappeared in another shape. That the story itself is not dying. The body itself, maybe the bones of it, the structure of it, but the spirit remains. And this is, of course, part of this conversation that we are having this week. The happy ending of the fairy tales, the myth, and the divine comedy of the soul is to be read not as a contradiction, but as a transcendence of the universal tragedy of man. The objective world remains what it was, but because of a shift of emphasis within the subject, it's beheld as though transformed. Where formerly life and death contended, now enduring being is made manifest, as indifferent to the accidents of time as the water boiling in the pot is to the destiny of a bubble, as the cosmos to the appearance and disappearance of a galaxy of stars. So we are connecting ourselves to what is so much bigger than us that it seems to be forever. We are connecting ourselves to this large world of infinity. But we are also reminded that we are not infinite, and this is the story that we are learning from this, and that we can remind ourselves through the myth that we exist in this space and time by the spirit of it, by touching those aspects that are the most meaningful to us. But we are also allowing for the story to be continued to other generations by repeating it. So we are finding our place in the world, and very, very practically, but we are finding our place in the world by also finding our place in the moment in which this particular story is told. And in the sense that those different moments are more or less fighting with one another, it is also our fight as humans to make sense out of all of it.